This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Okay, round two. Name something that's not boring.
A laundry? Ooh, a book club. Computer solitaire, huh?
Sorry, we were looking for Chumba Casino. That's right. ChumbaCasino.com has over 100 casino-style games. Join today and play for free for your chance to redeem some serious prizes. ChumbaCasino.com. No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited by law. 18 plus. Terms and conditions apply. See website for details.
Hello, it is Ryan, and I was on a flight the other day playing one of my favorite social spin slot games on ChumbaCasino.com. I looked over at the person sitting next to me, and you know what they were doing? They were also playing Chumba Casino. Coincidence? I think not. Everybody's loving having fun with it. Chumba Casino is home to hundreds of casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere, even at 30,000 feet. So sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com to claim your free welcome bonus. That's ChumbaCasino.com and live the Chumba life.
No purchase necessary. VGW. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18 plus.
We made this.
Welcome to Season 10 of the Japan on Film podcast. I'm glad to have you all back. I am, as always, your host, Perry Constantine. And as always, I am still a teacher, born and raised in Chicago, but currently based in Japan. And I have been teaching Japanese literature and film for about 10 years now. And today I am happy to welcome back a returning guest, and that is Derick McDuff. Derick, how you doing today?
I am doing well. We were talking beforehand about some trips you took. I just got back. I took a trip recently myself, so that was pretty fun. But yeah, I just rewatched this film that we're going to be talking about. It's one of my favorites, so I'm having a good day.
Okay, awesome. Where did you go?
I went to the music festival Life is Beautiful in Las Vegas, so I got to see my favorite band, The Killers, play in their hometown in Las Vegas. So that was pretty fun.
Oh, cool. Did you do any hit up any casinos while you were there?
I did. I didn't spend too much. I'm not a huge gambler, but I stayed in Sam's Town because of the Killers connection, and did a little bit of sports gambling there. I did a little bit of sports gambling at the new sports book, that huge one with the big pool that they've got. Because I was there on Sunday, so put a couple bets down. Made a little bit of money, not too much.
Nice. Yeah, I've only been to Vegas one time, and it was mostly because my brother wanted to go, and we were on a road trip anyway, and so we stopped over there for a night, and he wanted to go and hit up the casino and everything, and I'd gone in there and I'd taken a look around, but it was just definitely not my thing. I'm more of a poker guy, and with people I know, not with random strangers who are going to take all my money.
Yeah, that's not it's a different vibe than just like hanging out with your friends and playing some poker. It's much more intense, and I just used the little winnings I got to buy a very expensive Reuben that was delicious, but
but not worth the price. Yeah, that was the other thing.
No.
The prices of everything in there is just ridiculous.
Yeah, the Vegas tax is for real.
Yeah. Anyway, like you mentioned, today we're going to be talking about a movie, but before we get into that, why don't you? It's been a while since we had the show, and you were on last season. Why don't you give people a little bit of a reminder about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I am a podcaster as well. I host the film podcast Underrated, where, as the name would imply, we talk about underrated and underappreciated films. So just been recording a few episodes of that, gearing up for a big rebrand. So Underrated Movie Podcast, if you look that up anywhere, you'll find me. I also do some writing about film for places like Film Threat, and do some stuff for Watch Mojo, do some top 10 lists for them. So yeah, I'm doing a lot of stuff with film.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, and we still got to work out for me to come on to defend Alien 3 on your show at some point.
Yes. Yeah, so like I was saying, I've just been going through a big rebrand, and I've been thinking about that a lot. I actually mocked up some episode art for that episode, so we're gonna have you on soon, man. I just hopefully maybe in like January or February, I'm thinking. So.
Awesome. Yeah, I am so looking forward to that. But anyway, today we're talking about a movie that does not really need defending because it is pretty much universally beloved, and that is Princess Mononoke from 1997. This was one of Studio Ghibli's like biggest hits. Like this was the first Ghibli film that was released in the U.S. then was rated PG-13 actually, and it was it in Japan. It was like the second. It was like the highest grossing film in Japan of 1997, and it held Japan's box office record for domestic films up until Spirited Away, another Ghibli film, knocked it down.
Yeah, I want to say it held the record for just Japan box office in Japan in general until a couple months later when Titanic finally came out over there.
Oh, really? I didn't realize that either. Oh,
Yeah,
wow.
yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. And in
Short
fact,
run,
one
but
of
it held it.
yeah, and I'm not sure if it was this film or if it was another film, but there was one story about when it was released in the U.S. because Miramax was the distributor, and Miyazaki's. I can't remember if he had sent them a picture of a katana or he sent them an actual katana, but he sent them a katana or something like that, and it was attached with a note saying "no cuts."
Yeah, and
Because-
you know who he sent that to?
Yeah, Harvey Weinstein.
Yep.
Now, before we jump too much into this movie, what's your history with Ghibli?
So my history with Ghibli actually starts with this movie. In high school, my one of my best friends, I ended up being the best man at his wedding. We lived together for a while. He was in the Japanese club, and they would do like these Japanese movie nights. And I watched this movie and immediately just was like, this is incredible. And they did a couple more of those movie nights, and I went back and tried to watch them. I watched a few more of them, and over the years, I definitely made it a mission of mine to try and watch at least all of the Miyazaki directed Ghibli films, which I eventually did. And so I've seen all his. I haven't seen all of the Ghibli films. I've seen a smattering of other ones like Grave of the Fireflies and stuff. But I am a huge fan of this studio. I think that all the work they do is phenomenal. I'm so excited for The Boy and the Heron when it finally hits over here in the States. I think it's going to come out around Christmas time over here. So I'm a very big fan of this studio in general, and particularly Miyazaki.
Yeah, I'm not as much. Like I totally understand all the appeal of Miyazaki and Ghibli films, and I respect the man incredibly. Like he's a extremely talented director, artist, writer, triple threat, and he is just like his. I I think I joked about this in last season when we were talking about another Ghibli film, and when Taro Yamamoto, who was in Battle Royale, when he started gaining prominence as a politician here in Japan with his Reiwa party, newspapers were starting to call him the Japanese Bernie Sanders. And I actually say that I maintain that Miyazaki is the Japanese Bernie Sanders because he is very progressive and very outspoken, and he's got that very, kind of like grumpy progressive personality that Bernie Sanders has as well.
I would say that's the word I would use.
Yes,
yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. So I've got a huge amount of respect for him, and I do like his movies. I think my favorite of the Ghibli films and of Miyazaki's in general, is The Wind Rises. I think that was probably the one that impressed me the most. These other ones, like I like Spirited Away, I like Princess Mononoke, I like Howl's Moving Castle, but I was never as obsessed with Ghibli was as, like you are, or as, most people are actually. Like my students love Ghibli. Almost everybody I know, like when you talk about Studio Ghibli, their eyes light up. Like it's like a Pixar effect, right? Pixar too is that same kind of appeal to a lot of people. And I just, for some reason, it just never kind of appealed to me in the same way as it appealed to other people. So I'm coming at this from a little bit more of a muted enthusiasm from most.
Yeah, I think this and I love There's not a Miyazaki film that I dislike for sure. There's not. I don't think I've really disliked any of the Ghibli films, but of all of them, this one, like, it was the first one, but of all of them, it's always been my favorite. And it's a film that I remember just when I first saw it as a teenager. It was just kind of those movies that you watch and it rewires your brain. And I'm just like, I'm gonna love this movie forever. It's always, since the day I signed up on Letterboxd, it's been in my top 4 and has not moved out of it. So it's always been a big deal. I think maybe part of the reason why particularly Americans tend to like Ghibli a lot is because there is, especially with movies like Princess Mononoke, is that with animation, I feel like you either get kids animation or you get something that is trying hard to subvert that. And you don't get a lot of stuff that is just kind of like, oh, here's just like a really good animated movie for all audiences, which I think a lot of Ghibli films and a lot of Miyazaki films fit into really nicely.
Yeah, I mean, I go back to the Wind Rises as a really good example of that. I mean, that is a movie that could very easily have been done in live action. Or you mentioned Grave of the Fireflies. That's another one, too. You know, it could very easily have been a live action movie, and it did not have to be animation. Your Name is another one that, you know, very famous that we covered a while back, too. And yeah, there's a big reason why is because, you know, and I think I may have talked about this on the show before, but you know, in Japan, they don't have big access to the big movie studio sets that they have in America. Like, you know, Japan is basically the size of California, and a lot of that land is, and you've got half the population of the U.S. put into an island the size of California, and a lot of that island is not habitable, so they don't have a whole lot of area for location shooting. And so what would be like a, you know, what, like a $50 million rom-com or something like that, or drama that they would do in America, and they would do that in Japan. It's just so much more economical, both from finance point of view and from, you know, just the space point of view, to just do it as animation instead of doing it in live action. So that's why you see a whole lot more anime that is, well, that's why you see a lot more diversity in anime as opposed to in the West, where it's a lot more, you know, a lot more kid focused, although that has been changing in like the past, you know, 10 to 20 years or so.
Yeah, absolutely. And it reminds me of, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, but I covered Perfect Blue a while back on my show. And, you know, that's one that I feel like, yeah, like it could have totally been live action. I remember watching it and being like, oh, this movie seems like it should be maybe live action. And apparently it was going to be. And then I guess there was like some kind of fire or something in the studio. And they're like, well, let's just draw it. Let's just, you know, make this an animated movie. And what you're saying about there not having a lot of, you know, like money and space to build these big sets and stuff, that makes perfect sense because, yeah, like this film is a wide, expansive film that you know, you would have to like have these big, you know, 97, you wouldn't be able to do these big CGI wolves and stuff like that either.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And Perfect Blue is another, you know, perfect example. Another amazing movie too. And that was something that could have easily been done in live action. There actually is a live action version of it, but it's based more on the original novel, whereas the anime, you know, Satoshi Kon had kind of taken just kind of like the basic idea of it, and then he just changed everything else about it. And I have the live action movie, but I haven't watched it yet. But from what I understand, it is not very well received. It's people say it's nowhere near as good as the anime one, and in fact, it's, you know, a little bit boring. So eventually, you know, I'm hoping someone will come on to talk about that at some point, because I've always been curious to watch it, but it's apparently not as well received as the anime.
Yeah, I've heard not great things about it, and I feel like I know it's like, you know, not directly adapting the anime, but I feel like a lot of times when you try to adapt these things that were really popular in anime form, you run into a lot of trouble. You know, there's obviously Netflix has been trying that to varying degrees of success a lot recently. I always think of things like the Full Metal Alchemist movie that they did that was not great. So yeah, animation, it just, you know, I think of like people like Sid Fleischer and stuff who were like, yeah, we can do things with animation that you can't do in real life. And it just, and just now, the last, maybe 2 decades at most, live action is starting to be able to do things because of the advances in technology that animation has been able to do since day one.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the comic book writer Warren Ellis, he once described comics. He's like, they're words and pictures. You can do anything with words and pictures, and with anime too. It's the same idea, right? If you can draw it, you can do it in animation. Whereas in live action, it's more of a challenge. It's a lot more expensive. It's a lot more logistically difficult. But yeah, in animation, there's no limits to what you can do. And yeah, you're right. There have been a lot of attempts in the past, like I'd say probably like the past 10 years in Japan to do a lot of live action versions of popular animation. There's been obviously the Death Note movies. They had a bunch of live action ones of those. And not only in Japan, but in other places too, right? The live action Ghost in the Shell movie is another perfect example. And a whole bunch of other ones that I'm blanking on right now. But yeah, there have been all these attempts to do these things in live action and to very mixed results.
Yeah, absolutely. You never know what you're gonna get, and you if you want it to turn out well, you really have to put in a lot of money. And I feel like a lot of studios are not willing to take that big financial risk, because even if something is well received, or like you spend so much money. Look at what happened, this summer with movies like Indiana Jones. That movie made a lot of money, but it cost so much that it was still in the red.
Well, yeah, in fact, at the time that we're recording this, there's been a recent story coming out about Marvel where they're talking about how one of the big problems they had was with the upcoming Blade movie, where it just kept going through all these different, headaches with production, and now they're just trying to retool the whole thing as something that will cost under $100 million to make, as opposed to these big booming budgets that a lot of these movies have. And yeah, there's a place for those types of things too, but not every movie needs to be, needs to cost, $500 million or $1 billion to make, especially when the box office receipts are going to be such a challenge then to make back.
Yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, I feel like the mid-budget movies are kind of starting to disappear. You're getting these big, 100, $200 million movies, and then you've got the Blumhouses and like the A24s of the world that are making small movies, whereas the movies that might exist for $60 million are becoming few and far between. But because there's so many limitations, but like we keep going back to, animation is, you can do anything with it, and it's not going to cost you that much more.
Absolutely, yeah. So my history with this movie is I can't remember what my first Ghibli movie was. I know it was. I watched Princess Mononoke, Spirited Away, and Howl's Moving Castle like around the same period of time. I was in college, and this was like in the early aughts, and a buddy of mine, he really liked Ghibli, and so we had watched like all of those at some point. I think Howl may have been the first one, but I can't remember too much. So, but this does have another personal connection to me, because a lot of the scenery, a lot of the was inspired by when Miyazaki visited Yakushima, which is an island here in Kagoshima, where I'm based. So, in fact, they do like have like a Ghibli tour, I think, of the island there.
Huh. That's really cool. Yeah, like, and the visuals in this movie are so striking. Like it looks like there's that old frame that saying like every frame a painting, and I think it's literally true with this. You could take like just any still of this and hang it up on your wall. Like, this movie is basically a working moving work of art. And I honestly think, like, because I think that what makes this movie so incredible is like all the social commentary and the characters and just everything going on and the dynamics. But even if you take all of that out, I think this is still, and you watch this movie just on mute, it is still a great, great movie. because it is just striking, these visuals of this Japanese landscape, and the nature being the nature, and it's being juxtaposed with the kind of the industrial revolution that Japan is going through at the time. Those visuals are just so visceral and striking and beautiful and horrifying all at the same time, and sometimes it's doing something and sometimes it's doing something else. And I often, when I'm editing my podcast, I'll just put a movie on mute in the background, and I've definitely done that with this movie.
Yeah. No, yeah, it's that it kind of reminds, I mentioned Your Name before, and it kind of reminds me of Your Name in that way, because that's another movie where it's just stunning to look at, and like you said, you could put either one on mute and just look at the visuals. Like in both cases, especially the backgrounds are just so detailed and lush throughout the entire movie.
Yeah, definitely. I think, that's something that Ghibli has always been really, really great about, especially at this time period, is the backgrounds always look good. The characters in the background always look as good as the foregrounds. I know that's something that, for example, Disney at the time, their characters in the foregrounds always look great, but the characters in the backgrounds, not necessarily so much. But with Ghibli, it's like, yeah, even this random character, this old guy who's got rice on his face or whatever, this boar over here, this random Kodama, they all feel full of life. Like this forest that they're in feels just breathing and alive in every single frame, every single second of this film.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about some of the movie. Now, I don't think we have to recap this. I'm pretty sure everybody has seen this movie, so there's no need to go over the basics of the plot or anything like that. But what were some things that really kind of jumped out at you when you were rewatching it this time?
Hello, it is Ryan, and we could all use an extra bright spot in our day, couldn't we? Just to make up for things like sitting in traffic, doing the dishes, counting your steps, all the mundane stuff. That is why I'm such a big fan of Chumba Casino. Chumba Casino has all your favorite social casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere with daily bonuses. That should brighten your day a little. Actually, a lot. So sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com. That's ChumbaCasino.com.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18+.
With the Lucky Land Slots, you can get lucky just about anywhere.
This is your captain speaking. We've got clear runway and the weather's fine, but we're just going to circle up here a while and get lucky. No, nothing like that. It's just these cash prizes add up quick. So I suggest you sit back, keep your tray table upright, and start getting lucky.
Play for free at LuckyLandSlots.com. Are you feeling lucky? No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited by law. 18+ terms and conditions apply. See website for details.
Yeah, so, and for my rewatch this time, I really was just thinking about how, so many stories, and this is what I think drew me to it in the first place, but it was really hitting me again this time watching it. So many stories are just kind of like, you have your protagonist, you have your antagonist, and there's a point of view that you're really fighting for and one that you're not necessarily, rooting for. And in this movie, it's really saying that there's there's a protagonist for sure, and there's maybe antagonists, but I don't even think that you really could consider a lot of these people antagonists. I think that there's just opposing forces, and some of the forces are maybe a little more selfish, and some of them want certain things that clash with other ones, but they're all just trying to achieve what their own goals are in the world. They're fighting for people that they care about. Lady Eboshi, I think, is one of the most interesting, complex characters in any movie, because in any other movie, she'd be just typical villain. But this, you meet her and it's like, oh, she's this enemy of San. You think she's this enemy of nature. You have that montage of her burning the boar, but she quickly admits, yeah, that was me, but I'm here to provide for my people. I am trying to conquer the country or whatever, theoretically, but she's still fighting for. She takes these women who are it's kind of implied that they are prostitutes and slaves, and buys their freedom. She also cares for the lepers when literally no one else will. And then you have the boars who are trying to fight for nature, and the forest who's trying to fight for its own survival, and it's going up against civilization, and they have their own. They seem noble, but they also have their own issues. And you have like the samurai coming. There's all these other factions. You have the monks, the hunters, that come in, and they've got their own agenda. And at the center of it all is Ashitaka, who I think is such a fascinating character because he doesn't really have allegiances. Everyone kind of thinks that he's on the opposite side. Everyone's like, oh, he's actually with the animals, or oh, he's actually with the people, because he's really not trying to choose a side. And by doing that, everyone is just like, what's even his deal? And the way he kind of like oscillates and is trying to keep the peace and is trying to find this balance between civilization and nature and finding a way for humanity and the animals and the spirits to all live in harmony, I think is really, really fascinating. And is kind of the overall message of this movie, is just finding that balance, you know?
No, yeah, I agree with that completely. There's a lot of things you mentioned there that to talk about. And I think I'm going to start with Ashitaka, because I think you're right. He is he's someone who's not trying to pick a side. He's kind of like straddling the line between these different factions. And in a way, he's kind of like an audience surrogate in that, because just like you said, we can't really think about who we want to root for. The movie kind of goes in, it almost gives you, I think this movie kind of gives you an expectation just from the title and from the promotional materials and the poster and all that San is the one you're supposed to root for. She's the one who's supposed to be the one that you kind of like, you're on her side. But really, once you get into Irontown and Lady Eboshi and all that, you really kind of start to feel that, maybe it's not San that I'm supposed to side with. So I think just like Ashitaka, we as the viewers are kind of struggling throughout this whole movie to kind of see which side is the one that we feel like we should be supporting.
Yeah, absolutely. You do kind of feel that whiplash, because there are things that both sides do that seem noble and courageous, and both sides do things that are not great. And San seems very cold and cruel at times. But then at other times she seems very loving, and their dynamic is, I think, super interesting. Especially, I'm kind of skipping ahead to the end here, but the way they leave things, where he's like, "Yeah, I'll live in the forest, you'll live," and it's a very unique. It's I guess technically a romance, but it's not like a romance I can think of like in any other film, because they kind of just end in this like place with this understanding of each other, that they are able to find this balance, and they're able to live in harmony. They're almost representative of his civilization living in harmony of her with the forest, and each of them isn't really a great, avatar for either of those, because they're both kind of outsiders, but they find that peace. And I think that in most movies like this, you think of something like Avatar or something, it's very much like that theme. Other movies that have similar environmental messages, it's just like, it's very simple. It's very cut and dry. Like in Avatar, it's like, oh, nature good, and the humans coming here are all just bad guys. And even the ones that aren't bad guys, they just kind of realize, oh, maybe we should be defending nature. And then, that happens. Whereas this, it's so much more like, we've got to come to this middle ground, this understanding, living in harmony. And I think that's really cool.
Yeah. Well, also, and we'll talk more about San, because I want to mention something about even the title of this, Princess Mononoke, which is the title that Lady Eboshi bestows upon her, basically. But yeah, that goes to something, that comparison to Avatar is a good one, and it goes back to something you were saying about Lady Eboshi, how there isn't really a villain. I mean, I think there's not really an antagonist. There's definitely not really a villain in this movie at all, because if this were like a Disney movie or something like that, you would see a lot less shades of gray in Lady Eboshi's portrayal. Yeah. I mean, you mentioned the fact about her, even like her motivation. She's not really out to conquer anything. She's just trying to maintain this land, this town, and make this land prosperous for her and her people. She doesn't really recognize the Emperor's authority, but she still wants the Emperor's protection from Asano and all that. So there is this. So she's she's very much also, stuck between these different extremes, kind of like in the same way that Ashitaka is, because she wants to also, you know, she doesn't want to recognize the emperor and his authority, but at the same time, she needs to rely on him for help. Um, and she is a very progressive character for, not only that time, but just you know, even in modern times too. Like she is, the way she welcomes in the former sex workers and all that, and she gives them a second chance at life. Um, and she cares for the lepers and all that, and she's out to try and cure them, where, especially in Japan at that time, the lepers were, well, they were treated like lepers.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a couple things I noticed, in recently, and something that I picked up on this time is how weirdly she's very prophetic, almost like, well, she'll say something like, when San falls down, she's like, a wolf's head can still bite, and then the decapitated wolf's head's what ends up chewing off her arm, or she says something about, it seems like just some kind of, fluff that she's throwing out there about all this mythology and stuff, where she's like, oh, they believe that the blood of the deer god could cure, and she's like, maybe it could cure these lepers, maybe it could cure your arm. And that's what ends up happening at the end of the movie, is that, it's this, kind of horrible thing that happens when the deer god is killed and it falls, but then new life is brought into the valley, like just it springs up literally from the ground. And then, Ashitaka's curse is finally lifted. This horrible thing actually here's his curse. And it's something they don't even draw attention to. I didn't even notice it the first few times I watched it, but the lepers are cured too. Like the lepers, like there's a shot in it when one of them undoes their bandage and they're like, oh my gosh. And they've been cured by, this like undead, or this dead god that has fallen on them. And it's like blood has cured them of their affliction, And I thought that's like a really interesting thing that, it fits right in with all stuff about the deer god of life and death and it all being cyclical.
That reminds me, that makes me think of something else too. Because, a lot of Miyazaki's work is very much influenced by the war too. Wind Rises Again, even though he didn't direct it, Grave of the Fireflies, set during World War II. Howl's Moving Castle was very much influenced by the Iraq War. So there are all these kind of themes that he keeps going back to, and he keeps, revisiting in a lot of his work. And I think what you said there about, there's this great catastrophe that happens, but something good ends up coming out of it. I think you could look at the war as kind of how Japan changed after the war, because, Japan did horrendous things during the war. The U.S. too did horrendous things to Japan. I still maintain that the atomic bombs were a war crime. But out of all that death and destruction, Japan did finally, it was able to end fascism in Japan. It was able to make it a democratic country, and let it to become, going from being one of the poorest nations after the war to being one of the richest. So there was I think you could definitely see that aspect of it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that you bring up a good point. I think that is a real through line with Miyazaki's work, him being very anti-war and all the films you mentioned. But it's not, just like everything else in this movie, it's not a simple cut and dry thing. Because I think he does really recognize that, from like the ashes of this, horrible thing that we went through, something like the new Japan sprung up. And I think Miyazaki definitely has complicated feelings about that. But, he really puts it into his work here. I think, with The Wind Rises, that's almost like Oppenheimer from the other point of view. I think that's, that's a comparison that a lot of people started drawing this summer when Oppenheimer came out. And I think that, he's always got these very interesting heroes and villains who are complex. Speaking of war ones, I think Porco Rosso, the way that he's kind of depicted in that, I think he's a really interesting character. This World War I pilot who is, once again cursed and to look like a pig in this case. So it just shows how he realizes that the world is incredibly complex, and every cloud is a silver lining is a big oversimplification, but he does kind of seem to have that mindset where he's like, yeah, things in Japan are changing. They've always been changing, not always for the better, but there's always things that happen that we don't expect from them.
Well, yeah, that duality aspect is very much present in a lot of these characters because, on the one hand, yeah, it's not a good thing that Lady Eboshi is destroying the environment and clearing away all this land, but on the other hand, you know, she is doing a lot more for these people than anyone else ever has. Like nobody else is gonna touch these people. Nobody cares about sex workers. Nobody cares about the lepers. So she is the only one who is looking out for them. So and just like with Wind Rises, where you've got the Miyazaki's own complicated feelings, where you can recognize the beauty and the artistry of the Zero Plane, but also acknowledge the fact that the Zero Plane was used for death and destruction and sacrificing boys basically.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the stuff with the Zero Plane is honestly there's a lot of parallels between that and what's going on with the guns in Irontown. Irontown is literally, they call it Irontown because they are able to make this iron. It's a part of the Industrial Revolution when it's hitting Japan, and this kind of small town becomes very, very valuable because they are able to make these weapons that are just like the airplane did, which obviously Miyazaki is so fascinated by flight. But these guns are completely changing the world of Japan. You have the Emishi, the tribe that Ashitaka comes from. They're very reminiscent of this old way of life. They talk about how they had been kicked off of their lands 500 years ago. So they, even in terms of how ancient this old this movie was, they're very ancient. And then even more than the Emishi, like you have these spirit gods that are like, they have been around for thousands of years, and the world just starts to change so fast. You're able to see the way that this new technology, for better or worse, and in a lot of cases for worse, is changing things, but it's also being used to defend the people there. You have not only from the spirits, but what they say, like, now Irontown is valuable. You have Lord Asano's troops coming in, and she is able to give these women the tools to defend themselves that they would have never had. She's able to design these guns so that they are able to defend themselves and their families. So it's, more complicated stuff.
Well, yeah, I mean, I was actually thinking a lot of what's going on in Israel right now with a lot of these conflicts, because, yes, they, the Irontown has a right to defend itself, but at the same time, they all are also horning in on this other territory. And then, San has a reason to be angry at, what Irontown's doing, but, wanting to slaughter all the humans is not going to solve the problem.
Yeah, and I think that San herself is such, both San and Ashitaka, but especially San is just a really perfect dichotomy. They call her the wolf girl. She's not quite human, but she's definitely not wolf either. I love that speech that Moro gives where she's like, "My beautiful, ugly daughter," and she like uses all these like words that are almost like oxymorons, where they sound like they're conflicting with themselves to describe her. And she is that both her, and that's why they are the perfect representations of these worlds, that they can never, there'll always be other in these worlds that they live in, no matter what they do, where they would go. Because Ashitaka, he can never go home to the Emishi. San has never been able to, like, she was as a baby abandoned. So that's why they have this unique understanding that none of the other characters, Moro or Lady Eboshi or anybody, can really have, is because they have this unique perspective of being outsiders.
So the problem of conformity is a really big one here in Japan, because, and one of the things that they tell a lot of foreigners when they come to Japan is, you will never fully be part of Japanese society, right? Even if you get Japanese citizenship, even if you live your whole life in Japan, even if you master the Japanese language, you're fully immersed in the culture and all of that, you will never be fully Japanese just by virtue of your origins. And I think about that a lot when I was watching this movie, and the idea that San is a child of two worlds. She's never really going to fit in with either one of them. Same thing with Ashitaka, how he is forced to leave his home. He is now an outsider, and even if he joins Irontown, he's still going to be something of an outsider there too. And I think that's kind of symbolized by the fact that he promises to still visit San in the forest. And it actually made me think a lot of my own kids, because they're half Japanese, they're half American, so that's something that they're going to be living with throughout their lives, and that's something that a lot of kids from mixed race families often have to deal with. Is this idea of never being completely accepted by one side or the other? Like the one example I've heard about a lot is mixed race black and white kids in America, where they're too black for white communities, but they're too white for black communities. So there's that kind of aspect too. And I think that's very much symbolized. I think that's something that Miyazaki is trying to point out and trying to criticize too, which is another reason why I think Lady Eboshi is such a fascinating character, because she is providing that home of acceptance for everybody, but it comes at a cost.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's so interesting the way that these villagers, when they first meet Ashitaka, how they think of him, because they he's like, oh, this, they're like, it's almost like they see him as like, oh, he's just like this mysterious stranger, he's this, and they like kind of objectify him a lot. Like they keep calling, oh, he's this handsome guy, and he comes in or like in the manner just like, oh, he's this good strong guy. But then as soon as things start happening with San, they're like, we're grateful to you, but like, where do your allegiances lie? You're not one of us. Like, you saved us, but you're definitely not one of us. And there's that scene where like he ends up getting shot, and you really feel like he doesn't know where he belongs. He feels like maybe he wants to be here, but he definitely doesn't understand society. Like there's that great scene where he's trying to buy some rice, and he gives the person a gold nugget that I think is so good. So yeah, like you bring up a lot of really good points about just what it's like to be an outsider, and it might be something where it's because of how you were raised, or because of just who your parents might be, being biracial. That I think that's all in here.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's why I think it's so interesting that Eboshi is this one who is providing the home, and yet San is so much against her. Right? It's almost like she is completely rejecting the idea of acceptance, which can also be seen in both Ashitaka and San, and in the way that can also be reflected in a lot of people who live in these communities, because you have some people who will.
Judy was boring.
Hello.
Then Judy discovered ChumbaCasino.com.
It's my little escape.
Now Judy's the life of the party.
Oh, baby, mama's bringing home the bacon.
Whoa, take it easy, Judy. The Chumba life is for everybody. So go to ChumbaCasino.com and play over 100 casino-style games. Join today and play for free for your chance to redeem some serious prizes. ChumbaCasino.com.
No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited by law. 18 plus terms and conditions apply. See website for details.
Try to, like Ashitaka, I think, try to live in both worlds. Whereas you have someone like San who will reject one side of her heritage, basically, where in that case it's the human side of her heritage, which she utterly rejects, to the point where she says, she talks about humans, right? She doesn't, she doesn't refer to herself as a human. She doesn't even consider herself a human.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the place that she gets to at the end is very interesting, where she Ashitaka has that line about human hands must return it, and she's one of those hands. I think she kind of comes to accept by the end that she might not be necessarily one of these people, but she is human, and that she's obviously clearly at the beginning very, like, from right when he first saves her, very drawn to Ashitaka, and he's obviously drawn to her even before that. But yeah, like, she's very resistant to be in a romantic relationship or have any kind of connection with him, despite, him saving her life and everything. But by the end, it seems like she has really accepted this part of herself that she was shunning, and kind of found a better balance, to once again return to the big theme of this movie. She finds that balance.
Yeah. Well, and also too, I think it's interesting that even though all the residents of Irontown are outsiders in larger Japanese society, they still have conformity in their own society, right? They have this cohesive vision about what Irontown should be. So, and like you said, when Ashitaka comes in, they're like, well, they treat him as an outsider, in both positive and negative ways, which is something that happens here. Like, I've dealt with that as being an American in Japan. I have been, the objectified in a way, because of the fact that, just by virtue of the fact that I am a white guy. And that's something unusual when you're the only white guy in a town of, 16,000 Japanese people, which is the town I first came in. So I've seen that in the positive way, where everybody's like, oh, you're so cool, or you're so handsome, or anything like that. And, I want to talk with the cool white guy type of thing, or, which doesn't describe me at all, actually, but then I've also seen it the other way, the other side, where it's just like, fucking gaijin, right? And that kind of stuff. So I've experienced both sides of that outsider, but I've never been, completely a part of the community. Even when you are welcomed into the community, like, Ashitaka is there, he's still treated as an outsider. Like you said, right? The women are objectifying him. The men are talking about, like, how strong he is and all this kind of stuff. And they're all fawning all over him. That is not accepting someone into your society. That is still treating them as an outsider. You're being very polite to the outsider, but it is still a form of otherizing.
Yeah, definitely. And it's, something that I feel like I maybe relate to, like, a little bit too, is just like me being non-binary, but also, like, I looks like a regular, like, white dude, who still, like, I still appear like and act very male, but I still, like, maybe to, like, outsiders I seem a little too fruity, but then to, like, people in the LGBT community, it's like, he's just a regular looking dude who just mostly dates women. So, that's something that, even more than me, I know that's the thing that a lot of bisexual people deal with a lot. It's like, if you're dating someone of the opposite gender, then you can't at all be in our community. But then, like, you're too like, so it's that middle ground that so many people unfortunately can get caught in for a number of reasons.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, that reminds me of the controversy over stuff that DC Comics has done recently. When they made the Tim Drake Robin come out as bisexual, and you had a lot of people saying, like, well, how is that possible? He's dated women. I'm like, well, yeah, that's what bisexual means.
Yeah, I remember that, and I was just like, yeah, come on, like, that's literally the definition of it. Like, it's right there, the name, bisexual. Like, it's so funny. But yes. And then I think the character we haven't talked about at all, who is really interesting when it comes to all this, who is kind of the one observing all of this, and who kind of plays off of everyone's preconceived notions and is able to look at all the sides and pit them against each other, is Jiko. And I think he's really fascinating in that he is kind of here, and he's really just, he's out for himself. He's able to see what all these other people are doing. He's able to see the prejudices of everybody, and he's always seems like he's a step ahead, and he's not like a bad guy. Like, he's not like cruel or anything, but he's clearly just out for number one. And if somebody is trying to stop him, he will, like, screw you over. He will let, like, Lady Eboshi take the shot. At the end, though, when he is, like, human hands after it, he's like, all right, well, he doesn't want to die. He's like, all right, well, I'll work with you guys. So I think he's a really fascinating character we haven't really touched on.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, and just like with like Lady Eboshi or with San, you can't really fault him for having that viewpoint. Like it's it's a very chaotic time they're in here, and they're out in the middle of nowhere. There's threats all around. I mean, it makes total sense to just say like, I'm just going to focus on what's best for me, and everyone else is if it doesn't hurt me to help them out, I'll help them out. But otherwise, I'm just going to kind of like stay in my own lane.
Yeah, which is almost the exact opposite of Ashitaka's whole worldview. His whole thing is that if there is someone in like danger or in need of assistance, he will go out of his way to put himself in the situation where he can intervene and help to his own detriment much of the time. Like the movie literally starts with him, he gets this curse and has to like leave and has this kind of horrible thing happen to him, and he's like he kills a god, which is a very bad thing, but he does it because he is defending the life of someone he loves and cares about. And so he is like completely opposite of that character, and you see him do that time and time again, where he just jumps into these situations where he is trying to help and defend people, and people keep being like, whose side is he on anyway? Because he just wants to help everyone.
He's kind of a Superman character in that way, isn't he? Like he's this outsider who comes from another land. He's got he's just trying to help out. He's and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I guess he's kind of a Superman figure in that way.
Yeah, and I think that's why I think that he is one of my all-time favorite fictional characters ever. That's why I fell in love with this movie when I first saw it. Not just because of the visuals and the themes, but because it has all of these characters, but especially Ashitaka at its core, that really are just super fascinating. And I think he's not perfect, but he's still very aspirational. He does have a very interesting arc where at the beginning, you see he is kind of he's a little more gung-ho, and he's still very gung-ho at the end, but he is able to find, like all these other characters, that balance at the end. And he is able to, cure himself, and, like he even has that moment, which I think is a great moment, where he talks about how like his arm wants to kill Lady Eboshi. He's like, yeah, if that would end it, I would do it. So yeah, just one of my all-time, like up there with the greatest characters, I think, in movie history for me.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. I totally see the appeal of the character in that way too. Let's see, what other things I want to mention about him? One of the things I kept talking about Jico, one of the things that kept drawing me out from his character was the fact that Billy Bob Thornton voices him in the English version.
That's the one dub that I don't think is good. Like that's the one voice in the dub that I don't think works.
It is so distracting. And it's not that he gives a bad performance, but it's just I just don't think that voice fits that character.
Yeah, I completely agree, because I think that I'm somebody who likes usually to watch the subs instead of the dubs. But there'll be some times when I'll watch this, I'll have this movie on in the background because I'm doing something, because I do watch it, at least once a year, usually more than that. And I think that the English dub of this is very, very good. I think it's one of the better dubs. And I think almost everyone in it, they're all giving incredible performances, and they all feel very much like a part of this world. Like Billy Bob Billy Crudup, like he's kind of got that soft spoken thing, but he still kind of feels like a badass. Claire Danes, like at this time, she's super great. You've got Bender as the kind of like the main henchman guy. I love that, and they all fit very well with the voice that you would expect to be coming out of this character in this time period. And Billy Bob is just like you said, he's good, but it's like, why does this guy have like a deep Southern drawl? Like it's so different. It's the one voice that's so different from the original voice actor that it really throws you off.
See, it's been so long since I've seen the original one, and I actually meant to watch the Japanese version, but so I rip all my movies and I keep them on a hard drive and I run them through a Plex library, and I guess I had made a mistake when I'd ripped this movie because I did not rip the Japanese audio track, or it got mislabeled or something, because when I selected the Japanese audio track it was just English, so I don't know if something got mislabeled or screwed up in the conversion process, but whatever the case, I had to watch the English dub instead, which is not bad, right?
Yeah.
Like you said, it is a very good dub, and I think a lot of the Ghibli movies, especially, they really benefit from that Ghibli popularity, where they get A-list actors to voice them, right? Like you said, Billy Crudup as Ashitaka, Claire Danes as San, and especially at this time, right? 1997. This is like the peak of Claire Danes' popularity. Minnie Driver as Lady Eboshi, she does a great job too. Gillian Anderson as Moro. Lots of great actors that they bring in for these voices, and they all do a good job. Even if Thornton is completely miscast, he still does a good job in it.
Yeah, and speaking of that, I think it's not only the voice actors that are really great, but I think that the script for the dub itself is really good. And I think honestly, I think there is a lot to be gained by watching the English dub, for at least someone like me who is not doesn't speak Japanese, because there's going to be, or doesn't have as much of a familiarity with Japanese culture, because I think you're going to lose something if it's just kind of essentially literally translated from the Japanese, because the script for the dub was actually adapted by my favorite author, Neil Gaiman, who perfect for this. And I think because like Ghibli, especially at the time, was as big as it is, he's tailor-made for this. I think that a lot of the books that he's written have been turned into really good scripts that he's worked on. So it makes a lot of sense that he would do this. And I think that this is one of the more rewarding dubs out there because of that reason, because not only the actors, but because the way that it's kind of turned into a script that people can understand. There's little moments, like the one I always think of is the one like when he's walking away from Jiko, or Jigo as he's called in the dub, to go to Irontown. In the dub, the sub, it's subtitled as like "I knew he'd go," which kind of just is like nothing. But in the English version, he says "meet you there," which I think is just so, it works for that character. It kind of, it's like, okay, cool. Like we know where this is going. We know that he's setting things up. Like it works a lot better. And there's moments like that throughout that hit a little bit differently with the kind of context of Gaiman's translation.
Yeah, I think the fact that Gaiman wrote the script, I'd read that before I'd rewatched this movie, and I'm just thought, okay, why would you get Neil Gaiman, right? Why would you get this big name author to come in and just rewrite the translation? It seems like kind of a waste of his abilities, and a waste of the money you're spending to hire him. And so when I watched it, like I did have the subtitles turned on, and the subtitles were for the translation, and you could definitely see the differences. Like that's an interesting exercise if you ever want to, the next time you rewatch this, is watch it with the dub and watch it with the translated subtitles as opposed to the English closed captions, because you'll see where Gaiman did something different.
Yeah, and there's a lot of because like I said, I've watched it in both versions many times, and there are differences, and I think that it is, I love watching things in sub, but watch it if you haven't seen it in one or the other version. Anybody who's listening, go check out the other version, because it is a really rewarding thing to see it from both angles. I think that there's something you take away from each version that is a little bit different.
Yeah, and that's not something that often happens, right? It's very much, and typically the translation of the dubbed script it's just kind of an afterthought. You're not going to really focus too much effort on it, but you can see that Gaiman put real effort into rewriting that dialogue so that it sounded true to those characters. Because there are times when I was reading the translated subtitles, and I'm just like, Okay, wow, that is something completely different they're saying, like you pointed out in that scene. But what I'm hearing feels like it's a better fit for these characters than what the subtitled version was.
Yeah, and I think that's really good because I think, especially with something that is not only from another culture, but something that is portraying another culture hundreds of years ago, the
Mhm.
cultural context is going to be something that's lost on a foreign audience. So yeah, I think that money that they spent on Neil Gaiman was really well spent.
Yeah. Well, I think that's an important thing to do whenever you're. I think one of the reasons that the craze of remaking Japanese horror in America died out was because a lot of the studios forgot what had made The Ring so successful in the first place. It wasn't just that they took a Japanese movie and remade it. It's that they actually did the effort to translate the cultural stuff into an American context. So I mean, if you want to, we talked about this, a while, several years back on this show when we compared the American version to the Japanese version. But you watch them back to back, and you can see it makes it very clear why they made those decisions, why they made those choices. Another good extra example is Unforgiven, right? Both the original American version and then the Japanese remake of it. You watch those back to back and you can see how much of an effort was put into translating the cultural aspects of it beyond just, instead of having it set in the American Old West, you have it set in Meiji era Japan. They took the effort to show like, okay, this is how those cultural things in America, that's how we're going to make it fit in a Japanese context. And it's to a lesser degree, obviously, because they're not doing a full-on remake here, but there's definite effort putting into translating those cultural aspects so that the American audiences can better understand them.
Yeah, definitely because Americans might not understand like, a demon god or something like that, but like
Mhm.
they do spell it out really well. And then you cast someone like Keith David, and it's just like it works so well
Mhm.
to kind of give these characters gravitas. I think you bring up a really interesting point with the remake of Unforgiven because I think that's something that has happened back and forth between the U.S. and Japan in that time period when in America, westerns were very dominant, and in Japan,
Mhm.
samurai films were really dominant because you would so often get films that were direct remakes of one another. Going the
Right.
opposite way, you of course had Magnificent Seven being a remake of Seven Samurai, but ones that would how those kind of films would just influence each other. Even
Mhm.
something like Hidden Fortress. How much of the DNA of Star Wars is in that movie.
Right. Right. So much so that Lucas's first choice for Obi-Wan was actually Toshiro Mifune.
Yeah, and the last time I was on here, we talked about Kagomishu,
Mhm.
and how like basically that movie got made because George Lucas and Francis Ford Coppola were such fans of Kurosawa, and they wanted to help
Mhm.
him make this great, his kind of this huge vision that he had.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. No, well, another aspect too is you could think of, Power Rangers. And I had
Mm.
recently, because one of the things that always drove me nuts when I was watching Power Rangers is the idea that they have secret identities, but the villains already know who their secret identity is. Like, okay, so what is the purpose of this secret identity? Who is it? What is it serving? And then you watch the Zhu Ranger, the original Japanese version, and you understand it. It's because they didn't have secret identities in that show. That was that was something they got from American superhero tropes that they're like, well, American superheroes have secret identities, so let's give the kids secret identities. Whereas that wasn't at all in the original one.
Yeah, that's actually that really, really interesting. Yeah, I think Power Rangers is just in general such an interesting way of like, oh yeah, we're like it's like we're using this footage, but we're reshooting all the
Mhm.
stuff that is like when they're not doing the fights. So really, I grew up on Power Rangers, so I was a huge fan of that. And when I found out that it was like, oh yeah, like this is using old Japanese footage, I was like, that's pretty cool and pretty innovative.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting because it's funny too because we're talking about this translation aspect and how much care is put into that with Princess Mononoke or with Unforgiven or The Ring, whereas with Power Rangers there was not that same care put into it. It was just kind of like let's try and take this square peg and pound it and, hammer it until it fits in the round hole. Somehow it worked, but it doesn't often work like that. Like we see with a lot of those later era J-horror remakes.
Yeah, and I think this, like you mentioned, this is one of the first Ghibli films that really did hit big in the U.S. And I think that's not by accident. And I know you mentioned the whole thing about Miyazaki's assistant sending Weinstein the katana, and preserving, like obviously we talked about how they did do the changes for the dub and stuff like that, but this movie was like not cut down. That was something that Miyazaki had to deal with in the past. His early movies were cut down, they were changed. The Nausicaa in the Valley of the Wind was like retitled and completely changed. It was called like Warriors of the Wind or some nonsense like that. Even small stuff like Castle in the Sky, because American audiences were like much more, I guess, used to having wall to wall score. They put in all this extra score, but this one, other than kind of the stuff we talked about, is largely preserved. And I think it really, this and then eventually Spirited Away was like kind of the big step, helped to get Americans on board for this kind of film.
Yeah, and the Weinsteins, Miramax was especially notorious for that. Whenever they'd bring over movies from other countries and they'd release them in America, I mean, what was it, the Jet Li movie Hero, that was apparently cut to shit. Shall We Dance?
They'd even do it to they'd even do it to like American film, like Scorsese apparently. Like he had a big thing with Weinstein about cutting down gangs in New York.
Yeah. Shall We Dance, which is one of my, surprisingly when I tell people this, but it is actually one of my favorite Japanese movies. But you watch the American DVD release of it, and they cut out like an entire subplot that is crucial to the female character in that.
Mm-hmm.
It's so important to understanding who she is and why she acts the way she does, and they just it's completely excised from the American version. So yeah, that's a big problem they had. I remember, and even tinkering with the score. Again, another Jet Li movie, Black Mask. I covered that on Superhero Cinephiles several months back, and one of the things that drove me crazy of it was they just squeezed in this like rap soundtrack that does not fit the movie at all.
Yeah, and I think that's another big thing that this movie succeeds on, is that it, with the dub, it changes enough that we will understand and it'll flow a little bit better, but it doesn't change any of the aesthetics or any of the real choices that Miyazaki made. It doesn't try to like add score to make it more acceptable or more palatable to an international or American audience. It really keeps it preserved. And as someone who, I always champion, like, watch the movie in the way that the director originally intended. Like that's a big deal for me.
Yeah. And I think the fact that Gaiman is someone who is so supportive of other artists, and he is so respectful of other artists. Like, he's not someone who's going to come in and think I can make this better, right? He's someone who's going to say, like, my job here is to just make this easier for the American audiences to understand, and that's what I'm going to focus on. And I'm going to focus on trying to stay as true to Miyazaki's vision as possible. And I think he did. He definitely accomplished that.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think that comes back to why Billy Bob didn't work for either of us, because I mean, I know that the rest of them are all like American actors, but you don't feel like they're American. Like, Billy Bob just feels like he's like a good old American boy, but he's playing like this monk spy, and everyone else in it kind of feels like they could be from anywhere. Like they feel like, they have, British actors and American actors and all kinds of different stuff. But it's like, when you're casting it, it's like when you're casting like Ancient Rome or like the Chernobyl miniseries or something, like, they're not necessarily Russians, but they when they did Chernobyl, they specifically didn't cast any Americans in it because they didn't want people to feel like, oh, this is just like, like people just doing their accents. They cast people from all over the world just doing whatever accent they were doing, because it still felt like, oh, this is somewhere else. This is something that is not like like just does not Americanize like Billy Bob's accent was. If that makes
Right.
sense.
Yeah. No, it makes total sense. I mean, that totally explains why I had that why I had that disjointed feeling watching it. Now, I did want to talk about the name of the movie. Princess Mononoke, or Mononoke Hime, as it's as the Japanese title is, which literally just translates to. But do you know what the term Mononoke means?
Is it like Monster Princess or something, or Monster Girl? I'm
So
not entirely sure.
So what it means is it's a Japanese word that means like vengeful ghost or specter or a shapeshifter or something like that, and possesses people, causes suffering, disease, or death. So it's very telling that that they give this title to San. Because I remember the first time I watched it, I'm like, why is it called Princess Mononoke if her name is San? I don't get it. And so then now I get it. Like, now I understand what that was all about.
Yeah, and that's really interesting too, because they don't choose to translate that for the English title. They like still call it. They don't call it like the Vengeful Princess or something like that. They just keep, because it feels like a uniquely Japanese term that would be, it would lose a little bit of the direct translation. It's like how Infernal Affairs when it that has a lot more meaning in Chinese or in Mandarin, I guess it would be, than it did when it was translated. And so it when they remade it in America, the remake was called The Departed because it had similar kind of vibes to that. And I think it is a really good decision, and something that it makes a lot of sense to keep that original title, especially because Princess Mononoke is supposed to be a character that's kind of otherworldly and strange and something we don't really understand. So for American audiences, we're like, what is Mononoke? That keeps that kind of mystique to her.
Well, also it also kind of shows Lady Eboshi's impressions of San, because one of the keys about the Mononoke is they possess human people and they're causing this suffering. So it's almost like she's kind of absolving San of what she's doing, because she's saying basically that my reading of her giving her that name is that she's basically saying the wolves are possessing her, San. They're controlling her.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the things I did not I had a vague, like I said, understanding of what Mononoke meant, but I did not really ever have that context, and that does shed some light onto not necessarily her, but the way that she's perceived, and it lines up with all the actions that all the other characters take.
Right. Now, we haven't talked, we kind of danced around it, but we haven't really talked a whole lot about the environmental themes. And this is something that is, and it's funny, it's something that I was thinking about talking about here, but we went down so many other different rabbit holes that I forgot to even mention this. But I thought the environmental themes in Miyazaki's movies are very interesting. And that's something that he's, dealt with a lot in his work. And he is an environmentalist. He's very concerned about the global warming and the degradation of the environment. And it did make me think of, I'd recently rewatched The Matrix to teach it in the class, and one of my favorite scenes in that movie is when Agent Smith explains to Morpheus that humans aren't technically mammals, right? You are mammals adapt to their environment, but you humans don't do that. You come in, you consume everything, you destroy the environment, and then you move on to another one. And he said, you are a virus. That's exactly what you are. And I see that very much in what Eboshi's doing, right? I definitely, sympathize with San on that aspect of it.
Yeah, and I think that they are like he's like humans are a virus, that theme does kind of crop up here, but I think it's a lot more complicated, like I was saying, than so many other environmental movies. And I'll bring it back to Avatar again, because Avatar is like, well, the humans just have to leave at the end. Like they come into the forest, they try to take over the forest, they act like a virus there, and then they get rebuffed and they go home, and a couple of them stay to live and change their life. But this is so unique amongst environmental movies with an environmental message, because it's not saying, oh no, like just all progress is bad, all humans like encroaching are bad, the only way is to just go and like live in the forest. It's saying like, no, we can rebuild Irontown, and when we rebuild it, we'll rebuild it to be better and to be in harmony with nature. Not just like we're gonna like abandon all civilization, we're gonna abandon like the ironworks and all that. We're going to build a better way forward, which I think is a much better message, because it's not only like a like realistic, like it's like, you know, what are we supposed to take from Avatar? Like, should we all just go live in the forest? No, it's the saying like, no, we have to find better, more sustainable ways to live on this planet and to live in a way that we are in harmony with nature, and there is a balance between humans and like animals and the forest and everything else.
Yeah. No, yeah, absolutely. I think Avatar is a good comparison, because Avatar it's so one note in that aspect of it. And you know, even something like Castle in the Sky, where, you know, that, you know, when we talked about that last season, and one of the things about that movie that I realized when I was watching it is, you know, the machines and nature, they have no problem living in harmony together. The only problem is the humans that are pitting them against each other. And whereas this movie, it feels a lot more layered to that, and so much so that, you know, even Eboshi, you know, kind of learns a lesson from it, right? She has that whole thing where she's you know, she's not going to give up on the town. But she's also not going to keep doing what she's been doing. She's going to try and find a way to make something better.
Yeah, and her ending feels really earned and really powerful because of all that stuff, because of all the things she's gone through, and, you know, she's lost. And, you know, no, I love that at the end, all these characters who had all these blood feuds and stuff like that, they all have come to a place of understanding where they can move forward and move to a better, you know, future. And it's optimistic, but, you know, even then they are like, even so, like, we do know on one level that, yeah, the old forest is still dying. The old gods have died, and we, you know, like the dear god is dead, and we can hopefully build things better, but we have changed them, and we can't necessarily go back.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think that's, and yeah, the fact that Eboshi, you know, she, even after she gets her arm bit off at the end, right? She's still, because you could see that in a lesser movie, they would say something like, well, now she's going to vow even more to destroy the environment or whatever. But she, you know, it's a teachable moment for her more than anything else. And I think she recognizes that she is being justifiably punished. And I think that was very, very, very much more layered than a movie like Avatar. Absolutely.
Yeah, totally. And, you know, I love we haven't even talked about the Kodama, which are these, you know, they're the one like cute little Ghibli thing from this movie. I feel like, you know, when you go to, you know, like a store that sells like, you know, plushes or whatever, maybe you might see Yakul or something, but like there's a lot of stuff from like, there's like Totoros, and there's like all the things from Spirit. There's like No Face and stuff. This doesn't have a lot of that, but it does. I do think that the Kodama in this do serve that purpose of being this kind of avatar for nature and stuff like that. And they all do, you know, you see that there's that sad moment when they die, and it has that really heartbreaking, just like tune that's like this high pitched sad note. And the last thing you see in the movie, I believe it's the last shot, is just the one coming back. And I think that is a really just perfect way to end the film. It's like, yeah, this forest was dying, and all these spirits, these cute little guys are gone, but they're coming back.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's a pretty good note to end on, unless there's any final notes you wanted to mention about Princess Mononoke.
I mean, yeah, I feel like I could talk about this movie to the end of time, so I think that's a good way to end it.
Okay. Yeah, but I think what you said, and advising people to watch, if you've only seen one version of this, to go and watch the other version, I definitely echo that. I think it's well worth it. And, like you said, most people, and like we've said, most people have seen this movie. So it's not going to hurt you to watch it again in a different version. So that's a good, very good advice to end on, because obviously everyone's already seen this movie. But Derick, thanks for coming on again. And why don't you tell people where they can find you?
Yeah, thank you for having me. You can find me. Just look up Underrated Movie Podcast. Whatever you're listening to this on, we're on all the podcast apps, so it'll come up there. We're also on all. I'm also on all the social media, just under the same thing: Underrated Movie Podcast, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube now as well. And then we've also got a Patreon, patreon.com/Underrated Movie Podcast. So find us there. You can also find me on. I don't think any of the reviews I've written for them are out yet, but maybe by the time this comes out, Film Threat, I've got some stuff up there. Check me out on all those places. But the big one is Underrated.
Okay, yeah, we'll have a link to that in the show notes. And that does it for this episode of Japan on Film. It's good to be back for the 10th season. Japan on Film is made in conjunction with the We Made This network, so please make sure to check them out. Listen up next after the credits to hear what other shows are coming up. And that's all for now. Thanks so much for listening. We'll talk to you next time. The Japan on Film podcast is produced by me, Perry Constantine, in conjunction with the We Made This podcast network. Visit japanonfilm.com for show notes, episodes, merchandise, and information about being a guest yourself. You can also reach out to me on the website's contact form if you have questions or comments about Japanese movies or the show itself. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at JapanOnFilm. If you'd like to help support the show, you can donate at japanonfilm.com, WeMadeThisNetwork.com, or by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can find links with information about each guest and join the discussion on the We Made This Discord in the show notes of each episode. And now, listen to hear what's coming up next on the We Made This Network.
Welcome to the third age of podcasting.
The year is 2023.
The name of the podcast
is A Dream Given Form.
Join us for the 30th anniversary of Babylon 5 as we move to fortnightly episodes looking back at The Gathering, the pilot episode of Babylon 5, Season 1 and beyond, with a plethora of guests to join us too.
The Gathering is definitely one week where we critique. There's some good stuff in there, but we can absolutely critique too, I think.
I completely agree, definitely. I liken The Gathering and the first episode. I kind of compare them to the X-Files pilot and Deep Throat. I wouldn't say hate, but it's a very, very strong dislike of the cycle.
Yeah, well, I feel like the cycle ruined one of us childhood.
Yeah.
So,
essentially.
And also, as well, there were levels. There's Talia representing the cycle that destroyed her mother, and then there's Bester and Bester and Kelsey, who are just psychopaths, and they are the personification of everything that she hates.
And be sure to check out all our content from the last year of A Dream Given Form, including thematic look-backs at the show.
And today we're going to be discussing the three prominent leaders of Babylon 5. Sinclair, Sheridan, and Delenn.
We thought we would combine our two greatest loves, because it's not just Babylon 5, it's Lord of the Rings too, because there's a lot of Lord of the Rings influences that JMS drew upon developing Babylon 5, and even interviews with some of the stars of Babylon 5 itself.
He said, I'll tell you what. He said, what would you like to do if you had a character? I said, first of all, I don't want to carry a ray gun. I don't want to carry a blaster or a transporter thing and beam me up, Scotty. I want to be different than everybody you have on here. And I want to carry a sword because that is what he lives by. That's part of his thing, his warrior mentality.
I love hearing that people are still interested in Babylon 5. And, it's really an honor to continue the conversation around a show that meant so much to us. And, it was the little show that could.
So check out A Dream Given Form, a Babylon 5 podcast on the We Made This network.
The last
best hope
for peace.
Welcome to Make It So, a Star Trek Legacy podcast, engage your warp cores and get ready to embark on a thrilling journey through the depths of the 24th and 25th centuries. Have some fun on the Cerritos. Join the Enterprise D crew. Take a trip with Star Trek Voyager. Take some lessons on the Protostar, or even relax on Deep Space Nine. With Make It So, we pay homage to the rich legacy of Star Trek, celebrating its enduring impact on popular culture and its profound influence on science fiction as a whole. We honour the vision of Gene Roddenberry and the countless writers, actors and creators who have brought this incredible universe to life. So join us as we navigate the cosmic expanse of the final frontier, engage in lively discussions, dissecting episodes, analysing characters, and sharing our love for everything Star Trek. Whether you are a lifelong fan or just beginning your voyage, this podcast is for you. It's time to embark on a journey where the stars are our guides, where the impossible becomes possible, and where the spirit of exploration knows no bounds. Welcome aboard Make It So, the Star Trek Legacy podcast that will transport you to new frontiers and ignite your passion for the future. Make it so.